So then Frankel describes how him and his friend adopted a little game where every day they had to come up with one humorous situation. This is such a fantastic tip, especially when one is going through a rough time. But I think it should be one that we should adopt anyway as we go through life, to identify a few funny things, at least one funny thing that happened during the day, so that we'll be drawn out from the dark and the gloom that surrounds us each day. Because of the treatment that they received at the concentration camp, being killed at will, etc., the prisoners went through or suffered an inferiority complex. In their other life, of course, they had been bankers and they had been architects, and like Frankel himself had been a doctor. But now here, they were nothing, they were nobody. And so the prisoners suffered an inferiority complex. We all had once been or fancied ourselves to be somebody. Now we were treated like complete non-entities. And now Frankel is going to make a very important point here. He says, the consciousness of one's inner value is anchored in higher, more spiritual things and cannot be shaken by camp life. But how many free men, let alone prisoners, possess it? Without consciously thinking about it, the average prisoner felt himself utterly degraded. What does this mean? That if they are treated like they don't matter, there is a tendency then for one to feel that, yes, they don't matter. They mean nothing. It is difficult for us to reflect about our inner dignity when we know and we see ourselves being treated better because of how much money we have or don't have, the titles that we have or don't have. So depending on how the world is reacting to us, we have a tendency to then allow that to define us in this very world. And it is difficult for us to think that no, however they treat me, better or worse, I have an innate dignity. And yet, how important it is for us to often reflect on that and to act accordingly. And in the concentration camp, what they experienced, of course, was suffering. And the suffering that they endured caused them to feel that then there was therefore no meaning. And yet suffering is a part of life, Frankel tells us. And therefore, if there is meaning in the beauty and the wonderful things of life, then there also must be some meaning to be found in suffering. And this meaning, Frankel tells us, comes from being worthy of one's suffering. Quoting Dostoevsky, Frankel says, "There is only one thing that I dread, not to be worthy of my sufferings." And so this will be now the line that you will see being drawn in Frankel's life and in the other prisoners' lives that Frankel talks about. People who then sought to be worthy of the sufferings that they were going through. Because even in these conditions, he argues, they were not completely helpless. The people still retained the space to act. He says, at that moment of suffering where one recognizes their human dignity, he says, here lies the chance for a man either to make use or to forego the opportunities of attaining the moral values that a difficult situation may afford him. And this decides whether he is worthy of his sufferings or not. So at that point where we have to make a decision, a difficult moral decision, at that point we make a choice to either rise up and be worthy and live up to our human dignity, or we fall beneath our human dignity. Still talking about finding meaning in the concentration camp, Frankel also alludes to the idea of finding meaning through serving other people. He gives the example where a doctor rushed into the camp one day and he asked for volunteer doctors to come in and help look after the typhoid patients. And of course, looking after these patients meant sure death. But Frankel chooses to go. Why? And he says, against the urgent advice of my friends, and despite the fact that almost none of my colleagues offered their services, I decided to volunteer. I knew that working in a party I would die in a short time, but if I had to die, there might at least be some sense in my death. I thought it would doubtless be more to the purpose to try and help my comrades as a doctor than to vegetate or narrowly lose my life as the unproductive laborer that I was then. So at each point in time, do you see, Frankel is seeking to choose the option that gives some sense or some meaning to that suffering. And you will notice that at each point, that meaning and that suffering is something which is always beyond him. It is not a decision of self-service per se, but it is a decision of service of the other. And this commitment to his patients, Frankel retains up to the very end. He gives an example of when he wanted to escape with another fellow prisoner, but he walks in and he says this about one of his colleagues, one of the patients that he was looking after. He says, I came to my only countryman who was almost dying and whose life it had been my ambition to save in spite of his condition. So Frankel had given himself to saving this person, to saving his countryman and looking after him. But now he had the option to run away with another prisoner to escape from the camp. And when he looks at this patient, he realizes that he cannot leave him. He doesn't want to leave him behind. And so he goes to the prisoner and he says, you can go, but I'm going to stay. And he stays. And after making that decision, he says, I gained an inward peace that I never experienced before. Again, having found meaning in another other than oneself. He says that because they were always in a group, they were always being pushed from one place to another, there was a tendency for the person, the individual, to think of himself then as only part of an enormous mass of people. And yet Frankel says that it is very necessary every once in a while to draw oneself away from the crowd. Yes, he says, there were times, of course, when it was possible and even necessary to keep away from the crowd. Why? Because the human being needs solitude. They need a time away when they can come back to themselves and when they can learn and get a sense of self and resort back to that inner life we're talking about, where they can think through things and get a sense of I am an individual. Still in conversation about inner life, he illustrates one very moving incident where all of them, the prisoners, were sitting at the doorstep of their hut sipping soup. And one prisoner runs in and comes and tells them to come and see. And he leads them to look at a very beautiful sunset. And they sit gazing at this sunset for a few minutes. And one prisoner looks and says, how beautiful the world could be. And here you see that. You see the movement from just seeing this sunset, leading them to reflect inwardly about a better world, a more beautiful world. When was the last time you looked at the sunset? What about art? Frankel says, is there such a thing in a concentration camp? And he says, it rather depends on what one chooses to call art. A kind of cabaret was improvised from time to time. Clearly, it wasn't the kind of art that led one to think about great ideas, but they were so starved for any form of entertainment and mental relaxation that even this very low form of art and amusement, they often engaged in, they often partook in that. He says, they came to have a few laughs or perhaps to cry a little anyway to forget. There were songs, poems, jokes, some with underlying satire regarding the camp. All were meant to help us forget, and they did help. Which introduces a thought in us about our tendency to scroll through the phone many times when we are idling or at the end of a very heavy day. To scroll through the phones, watching the memes and the Instagram posts and the Facebook posts, all that. And this is a reflection of our souls, or rather our spirit's starvation for some form of elevation. The point being here that the memes and the pictures and everything that we see on social media sometimes might not be the highest form of art that we would want to engage in. And rather, what you'd want to do is to read something a bit deeper, which then will give us a much more lasting effect to our soul rather than the short-term pleasure that we're going to get from the memes or from the little jokes and the cheap entertainment that is all around us. Frankel also talks about the necessity of humor and cultivating humor in any situation. He says that humor was another of the soul's weapon in the fight for self-preservation. It is well known that humor, more than anything else in the human makeup, can afford an aloofness and an ability to rise above any situation, even if only for a few seconds. So then Frankel describes how him and his friend adopted a little game where every day they had to come up with one humorous situation. This is such a fantastic tip, especially when one is going through a rough time. But I think it should be one that we should adopt anyway as we go through life, to identify a few funny things, at least one funny thing that happened during the day, so that we'll be drawn out from the dark and the gloom that surrounds us each day. As Frankel tells us, the attempt to develop a sense of humor and to see things in a humorous light is some kind of a trick learned while mastering the art of living. How, though? How will seeing humor in a situation alleviate the suffering that one goes through? And Frankel explains that the human soul can be, if it can be equated to a gas chamber, whereby a small amount of suffering, which is like air introduced into the gas chamber, will very soon envelop the whole gas chamber. In the same way, a little amount of suffering, doesn't matter how little it is, if left alone there by itself, will eventually then envelop the whole soul, your whole spirit. Thus, Frankel says, the size of human suffering is absolutely relative. No matter how small or how big it is, left to itself, it will eventually envelop the whole soul.